I'm pleased to be here to speak to you, and I thank you all for coming, and I appreciate your interest in this topic, which is not just very important for Palestinians and Israelis. It is important to a lot of people, and in particular the United States, because the United States plays a big role in this situation. The reason I do lecture about it, and actually I taught a class at Oli here at the Ocean Life Learning Institute about it. The reason I want people to know is that because it is very much misunderstood in the United States, and the media does not tell you everything, and there's a lot of intentional misrepresentation. And for you as Americans, for us as Americans, because I'm also an American now, your tax money plays a vital part in what is going on. And also, there are a lot of other things that affect you indirectly, perhaps, and in some cases directly, that also result from this situation. A lot of people hear about the Palestine-Israel situation, but they hear only one part, and they interpret it rationally as far as they learned it. But we know that in something like this, which has been going on for more than a century now, there are many aspects of it, and unless you actually learn the basics, then you will not be able to evaluate what is happening. This reminds me of actually a poem. Most likely you may have heard of it. It's called The Six Blind Men and the Elephant. And I used it before in a lecture like this. It's I think British John Godfrey is the poet, and it goes like this. It was 6 men of Hindustan, to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant, and happening to fall against his broad and sturdy side, at once began to bawl. God bless me, but the elephant is very like a wall. The second, feeling of the tusk, cried, Ho! What have we here? So very round and smooth and sharp, to me it's mighty clear. This wonder of an elephant is very like a spear. Now there are 6 of them, so I won't read the whole thing, but the other 4 also looked at a different side. And so the end of this poem, to use a little less time for it, goes like this. And this And so these men of Hindustan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right and all were in the wrong. This is very much related to the Palestine situation because I've been here, for a long time, and I have talked to a lot of people, friends and things like that. And very often I hear some things that are outrageously wrong, and I know that people don't know about it. In fact, you will find even the names of the books that have been written about it are always have an implication. And one particular website by an American lady called Alison Weir is called If Americans Knew. If Americans Knew. And she, on her website, describes and puts a lot of material about what happened and what is happening. So, for this reason, because most people do not know the basics, when I talk about it, most of the time I start from scratch. And so I will start this time also from scratch, and let's see here. The first thing you need to know about this problem is Zionism. Zionism is a movement that started in Europe in the early 19th century, and it was a belief eventually that Jews who are persecuted or who were persecuted in Europe must have a state of their own. And the author of a book on that material wrote a book called The Jewish State. And in that, I need to read you something of what he wrote. All right. He advocated a state which eventually the Zionists, the people who accepted this mission, they decided that the state should be in Palestine. And some Jews did not accept that. Some accepted that. The religious Jews at the time did not accept the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. But the Zionist movement, gathered followers and Jews who accepted that, and eventually. First of all, you should know that Zionist is not necessarily a Jew. There are non-Jews who are Zionists, and there are Jews who are not Zionists. So actually, that's very important to know. So they started by, an organization was established, and they started by trying to influence the British government. And the British government at that time, eventually there was the First World War, and towards the end of the First World War, the British promised some influential Jewish people at that time, the British promised to establish for the Jews a state. They didn't call it a state, they called it a home, a national home in Palestine. And that promise is called the Balfour Declaration. Balfour is the minister who granted the promise. And this is actually the beginning of the problem. But let us first notice that the British did not own the land, and so the people who did not own the land promised to give it away to people who were not even there. At that time, there were Jews living in Palestine, but they were approximately 6% of the population. And most of them were you might call Arab Jews, like to have American Jews and French Jews and so on. They were Arab Jews, so they spoke the language and so on. So they were just as much part of the country as we were. But that's only actually less than 6%, because by then some of them had already come from abroad to live in Palestine. There were some refugees. This Balfour Declaration was made in 1917. A few years later, of course, 1 year later, the First World War ended in the 18th year, 1918. And at that time, the British and the French occupied the land that is now Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. They weren't called that way that time. It was the British and the French who divided this area into and made four countries out of it: Syria, Lebanon, and then Jordan. At that time, it used to be called Transjordan because it was only east of the Jordan River. West of the Jordan River and next to Jordan was Palestine. And the British became the imperial occupiers of Palestine at that time. There was no United Nations, but there was the League of Nations, and the British arranged to be responsible for ruling Palestine. Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan actually became eventually independent but Palestine was occupied by the British. And they did it especially to allow immigration of Jews from Europe to Palestine. Why Palestine? Because it was believed, Jews believed, that actually Jews outside of Palestine were actually originally from Palestine. And actually that why do Jews in Europe, why are they in Palestine? The belief, and it still held a great deal, that actually they were banished by the Romans, in other words, moved all the Jews out of Palestine, the Romans did, and that's why there are Jews in Europe. Now, this actually has been challenged by some writers, but the most well-known is this book here. It is called Invention of the Jewish People. It's written by a historian, an Israeli historian by the name of Shlomo Sand. And he researched the history of the Jews. He himself is a historian and has some other works on history of the Jews and other books. He decided from his investigation that there was no banishment of Jews from Palestine. Where did they come from? A nation in Eastern Europe, a kingdom that actually all its inhabitants, now this is what he says, I'm not a historian, and some other books written on the same thing, and they were called the Cossacks, and they converted to Judaism, and so that actually the Jews of Europe, most of them, do not have an origin in the Middle East. He even said, he said first that the Romans had very good records historically of what they did, and there is no mention at all of this incident. The second thing is that how 2,000 years ago, where there were no airplanes and maybe small ships, how can you transfer an entire population over the Mediterranean to Europe? So his decision was that the Jews of Europe were not descendants of the Jews that were in Palestine. In other words, they are not even Semitic. Of course, Arabs are Semites. The closest language to Hebrew, perhaps, is Arabic. The other argument that he put, he said, well, if they were not banished, so where are they? Well, the answer he gave is that they were in Palestine. Now, we in Palestine consider ourselves Arabs because our language is Arabic, our culture is Arabic, and there's no question that we are mixed with whoever lived in that place. And his conclusion, not mine, Shlomo Sand, he said that the Jews mixed with the population, so that actually his conclusion was the current Palestinians are actually descendants of the Jews who actually lived in Palestine. Now, that's not the issue anymore, of course, but it is important because there are still a lot of people who believe that the Jews that went to Palestine actually were going back. Well, actually, they were not going back, because I can guarantee you that none of them was 2,000 years old. Now, that is Zionism. The next thing that happens is that the British become the rulers of Palestine. They were called the Mandate because actually they were approved by the League of Nations, and they were given a mandate over Palestine. They ruled Palestine for 30 years. And from the very beginning, started accepting immigrants from Europe, Jewish immigrants, regardless of the wish or approval of the native population. Now, when they started, that's the time when Jews were 6% of the country, and the rest of the country was owned by who? By its own inhabitants. As soon as they started ruling the country, they allowed immigration. And within maybe just a couple of years, the population, the Jewish population in Palestine increased to 16%, and the rest, of course, were Palestinian Arabs, and about maybe 10% of the population was Christian, and the rest were Muslims. And immigration continued. Palestinians revolted in 1936, but by that time, the British, actually, I'm talking here, the Jews of Palestine were already forming militia under and with the help of the British. They were also establishing governmental institutions, preparing for a day when they take the country. So within a few years of British rule, the Jewish population increased to 16% of the country. And that continued, and of course there was the Second World War. And then, of course, Hitler came to power, and we know that that's the time of the Holocaust. But it should be easily understood that contrary to what is sometimes said, that establishment of Palestine was because of the Holocaust, the answer is no. Balfour Declaration was given in 1917. The Holocaust was not part of history until 1933 or after that. Now, we get to perhaps the next phase. I'm marking it. I'm marking it with my books here. By 1947, by 1947, the population of Palestine was approximately 1.5 million, of which roughly 1 million were Palestinian Christian and Muslims, and 500,000 were Jewish. But there was a tremendous difference in organization, in power, and in institutional government. The Palestinians were simply not allowed to form governmental institution. They were searched all the time, so they were not allowed to form militia. And of course, the British had made their promise, and they even, according to the author of this book, who is also Israeli, who says that actually the British helped, trained the militia, or maybe not all, but trained the militia of the Jews of Palestine. And then this, of course, what happened at the time was that a lot of, after the Second World War, a lot of Jews were going to emigrate out of Germany. And of course, that's a very sad chapter for the Jews, that they were persecuted that way. The Zionist leaders wanted the immigrants from Germany, from Europe, to go to Palestine. But now we come to the involvement of the United States. President Roosevelt did not immediately accept that idea, and he proposed a different solution. He talked of a plan in which Western countries, in particular the United States, the United Kingdom, and other, France and so on, that the United States would accept 150,000 Jews from Europe. The United Kingdom would accept 150,000 Jews from Europe, and 200,000 would be accepted by other countries. And that is a plan he wanted to execute. It's not much known, but it is very well documented. But the Zionist leaders refused. Refused because they wanted people to go to Palestine. They wanted Jews to go to Palestine. And actually, they opposed the idea. The story is that President Roosevelt sent one of his Jewish collaborators, friends, to meet other Zionist leaders, and his friend came back complaining that they actually insulted him, and anyway, that's how that ended. So now we are talking about 1947 and 1948, after the end of the Second World War. The British at that time decided that they were going to leave Palestine. And they set a date of wanting to leave in May 1948. But they declared that about 6 months later, or earlier, I'm sorry, 6 months earlier. And then they decided not to have to do anything about the situation. They said, now there's the United Nations, so the United Nations will make the decision about how to solve this problem. through the influence of the United States and Jews, Palestinian Jews, the Zionists, they decided that the country should be divided into two parts. One, a Jewish state, the other one, a Palestinian state. But now let us look technically. How can this be practical? The United Nations was established to establish peace, to promote peace in the world. They did not have an army. So how can they convince the inhabitants to leave in one place to the other? How can they do that? Actually, they came out with a solution, and they approved it. This is now the United Nations, that Palestine would be divided into two parts. I don't have the maps here, but the two parts were 56% for Jews and 44% for Palestinians. Now we are talking here about a time when Jews were only 1/3 of the population, while Palestinians were 2/3. More important, who owned the land? Now here come Ilan Pappé here in this book. He is the authority on this part of the history of Palestine-Israel. Not only Jews were 1/3 of the country, their land ownership was 6.8% of cultivable land in Palestine. 6.8%. Who owns the rest of the land? The people who have been living in that place for centuries, or much more than that, for thousands of years. Now, the other thing is this, that I'd like to move my leg a little bit. How are you going to convince the Palestinians to leave their homes? Not only leave forever and give up their homes and their property from the land that was allocated by the United Nations for the Jews. Or you can force them. But by that time, the British were out of the country. They actually were not out of the country yet. That's important. They just simply withdrew themselves from the equation. That's all. The Arabs, the Palestinian Arabs, were not organized. We are talking about a more sophisticated Jewish people coming from Europe, and they established militia with the help of the British. And the British were not going to do anything. And there was this 6 months period between the time that the British were there and leaving. They were leaving 6 months later. Now, Palestinian Arabs had a militia, but it wasn't really adequate to oppose the power of the Jewish people. At this time, Ben-Gurion and a committee of his had already anticipated that moment. They already had militia that is trained, and they immediately decided to attack Palestinians. Now, the Palestinians were hoping that the neighboring Arab countries would be able to defend them. But there's a technical problem here. The British were still in the country. Armies of other countries could not enter, and they would have had to fight the British also if they entered. So they did not. And so what happened, that the Israeli militia was fighting a population that was not powerful, most of the villages and the towns did not have defense. And now I can look at, for example, quotations from the plan. The plan was called Plan Daley. And according to this plan, Ben-Gurion gave his order. Ben-Gurion is the Zionist leader, was on it from the very beginning, and he is the one that became the first prime minister of Israel. At that time, he made a statement. He said, I sort of have it here, but I missed my papers here, so I will. He said, now we are at a time when we have to hurt them meaning the Palestinians, and mothers and children, women and children included. This is the quotation of what he said. And this is what they did. They have orders. Go to the village or the town, or urban area, and dismiss all the inhabitants. If they resist, shoot them. Now, let me just first, before you think I'm creating this is the source. Now, I'm a Palestinian, Egyptian origin, but I'm from there. And at that time, when we left Palestine, I really did not know enough about what happened. Eventually, the Israelis and Americans and British made their old, documents available, and a number of Israelis did exactly what the author of this book, Ilan Pappé, did, which is to research what really happened in Palestine in 1948 and 1947. The title of the book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. They attacked every village and the bulk of the urban areas. Now, this started when I was still there. And one of the cities that was taken at that time was Haifa, the city that I was born in. And Haifa, actually, I lived in Acre, Palestine, which is across the bay. This map is not large enough. It is right here. There is a bay called the Bay of Acre. And Acre is an ancient city, and it has a wall around it, just like medieval times. And I was sitting at the wall with a friend of mine and watching the boats, which were British boats, helping Palestinians who were running away from the attack on Haifa and going to the harbor, trying to come to Acre. And we watched them come. I remember that day very well, because after we left, the principal of the school saw us on the street, two of us, both of us were in his school, and he said, right now we have to go, you can go to the school, we are closed as of now, and actually we want to empty places for the refugees. But at that time, I didn't know the extent. There was one massacre that everybody knew about it. It was called Deir Yassin massacre. And they actually went in and killed everybody, including babies. This is well known and documented. And it made news. And if you look in maybe in old, I didn't, but was published in American papers at that time. "500 villages and urban areas were taken. All this time, not really fighting, because they tell you that that is a case where the Arab countries came and we defeated 7 Arab countries or something, I don't know, 6 or so. That's the claim. The bulk of the work that was done before the Arab armies came in. And by that time, and all this is documented here. Eventually, now, when you think about it, the British were ruling the country. They were the government still during that half year. They made absolutely no attempt to protect the population, which was under their jurisdiction. In fact, I think it is easy to almost conclude that the whole plan was to give the Jews half a year in which they do what the British planned for them to do, which has become the dominant people in the country. 3/4 of the inhabitants of Palestine became refugees at that time. Of course, a lot, and actually that the massacre of Deir Yassin was not the only one. These authors, and all of them are Israeli, I think there's one written by Palestinian, 4 or 5 authors wrote about the same thing, and they also uncovered the fact that there were at least 20 massacres. In other words, they killed a lot more people than was thought. And that's the creation of the refugee problem among Palestinians. People left. There wasn't much places to go, except, people go to the neighboring country. That they fled to, the neighboring Arab countries and the parts of Palestine that were not yet taken by Jews. The result of this was, of course, eventually the Arab countries did send armies, but at that time there were no match for the Israeli, not even quantitatively. They were not as well trained. They were not as many, and they were not as well equipped. And the end was a defeat of the Arab armies. And what happened then? By 1948, of course, we left, my family left just maybe before the declaration of Israel, which was exactly on the day that the British left. And so I wasn't there when the Arab armies came, but we had they bombed Acre, which was 100% Arab. They bombed it from the outside, and the next day you found most of the population, including us, with their own little belongings, finding a way of leaving the country. So a lot of people left that way, and actually some people were actually removed from their houses and ordered to go somewhere else. All right. So what's the result, therefore, of this situation? 3/4 of the Palestinians became refugees. And Israel now, which was allocated 56% of the country, actually were able to occupy 78%. The rest of Palestine was 22%. This is Palestine. All this here is Palestine. There's nothing else on it except the Mediterranean. Maybe some Lebanese border here. This is Acre, my hometown. This is Haifa, where I was born. Now, this here, all this here, what became known as the West Bank. And there it was occupied by the Jordanian army. And the king of Jordan at that time, who is he is the grandfather of the current king, he had ambitions of increasing his country, the area, ruling over a bigger part. And their army actually had a Jewish commander, not Jewish, English commander, well known in the Arab countries. And they had already arranged, according to later information, they were already have agreement with Israelis how much to occupy, and so they only satisfied by taking this part here, and they made it part of Jordan. Jordan used to be called Transjordan, but when they took this part, they called it Jordan. And the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem came under Arab rule in 1948. There was a decision by the United Nations that Palestinians who left, the 750,000 who left Palestine, should be allowed to go back to their homes. And that was a decision of the, can you time me? Okay. What?
It's 8:02.
Yeah, but we did not start at 7, so what the turn? I can go for another half hour? Okay. All right. So the decision by the United Nations was that all Palestinian refugees should go back to their homes in what became mostly Israel. And if they accept that they should be compensated if they don't want to go. This is who is going to execute that decision? The United Nations doesn't have an army. They just actually, the United Nations has absolutely no right to divide the country. That's not part of their mission. Their mission is peace, not creating conditions where there is war. And at the same time, the British were not about to do anything about that. By the time that this was passed, they were already out of the country. And the refugees remain refugees until today. And there is approximately maybe 8 million of them. I don't know exactly, because actually they have their descendants now. At the beginning, they were living in tents, but eventually some of them were able to work and build houses and so on. So now they live in ghettos. They live in very small apartments, where you have maybe 10 or 12 people living in the same apartment until today. And some of them are in the West Bank. Some of them are in Lebanon. Some of them are in Syria, and of course right now, because of what's going on, they are being hurt. And a large number was in Jordan, and they still are there. The next thing we can talk about now is what happened in 1967. Now, there was a war, there was an attack on Egypt in particular in 1956. And that is when Nasser, president who was in power at that time, nationalized the Suez Canal. So the British, the French, and the Israelis attacked. Now, the Israelis attacked because they wanted more land. They wanted access to the Suez Canal. At that time, they were able to take it, because actually after they attacked Sinai, Nasser realized that the French and the British were attacking more directly in other parts of Egypt, and he withdrew all the army from Sinai. At that time, something happened that doesn't happen anymore. President Eisenhower did not like what happened, and he made it very clear. And this was the only president in the history of the conflict who told the Israelis, you go back and release Sinai to the original owners. And of course, they did not occupy only Sinai, they occupied the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip Gaza was a small city, and when in 1948 the Palestinian refugee problem was created, a lot of refugees started living in Gaza. So Gaza now has a population of about 1.5 million. And they, of course, this is the small part, 1.5 million people living in an area that actually would fit right inside Huntsville, Alabama. That's how big it is. So, coming back to Eisenhower, he told the Israelis, you evacuate or else you don't get assistance from the United States. And they accepted. If this can happen today, this problem would have been solved a long time ago. But we're coming to that. I hope I get to it early now. The next thing that happened was 1967, when Israel attacked. Oh yes, they say it was the Egyptians were prepared to attack, but then actually all their documents and a lot of their leaders say that we knew perfectly well. Even Menachem Begin said we knew they were not going to attack because they did not have significant force in Sinai. They attacked, and they took the West Bank, they took the Gaza Strip, they took Sinai, and they took part of Syria called the Golan Heights. That is part of what they want. They want to spread and bring more and more refugees to live in Palestine. If you are Jewish, if you can prove you are Jewish, you automatically will be accepted in Palestine. But if you are Palestinian, you probably will be shot if you try to enter on your own without permission, and most likely you will not get permission anyway. So what happens after 1967? Eventually, the Sinai Peninsula was returned to Egypt. President Carter was able to help Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat agree that Egypt will recognize Israel and establish a treaty, and Israel will leave the Sinai Peninsula. What Menachem wanted Egypt is the biggest country. By then, it had a reasonably effective, perhaps, army. And they wanted to concentrate on the West Bank. And so they left Sinai, and they ruled only the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. So what did they do since then? They started dismissing Palestinians from their homes, demolishing their homes, and this is the second time around now. Demolishing their homes and building new houses for Jews only. Not only that, today there are approximately 500,000 Israelis living in the West Bank. The land they live on, they dismissed Arabs from that land. In some cases, they cut the olive trees that the Palestinians used to leave as a means of livelihood. Established roads on Palestinian land, but the Palestinians are not allowed to use these roads. This is roads in the part which became Palestine after became part of, was not taken, the part, the 22% that Israel did not take in 1948. The settlements, they are actually colonies. They are because the United Nations, with approval from all the Security Council, including the United States, approved a resolution that Israel must withdraw back to pre-1967 boundary. And the Arab countries met at one time and promised Israel publicly that if Israel accepted to go back to the pre-1967 boundary and allowed Palestinians to rule East Jerusalem, which was part of the 22% that was not taken by Israel, that they would actually establish normal relationship and have peace with Israel, with a reasonable solution for the Palestinian refugees also. Israel refused that. Now we have now to ask if the United States was one of the signatories to the resolution that required Israel to withdraw, why do they finance it when it is establishing a situation where that cannot happen? Because right now, what happens is this. Imagine yourself a Palestinian living in a village in the West Bank. They send you a notice that your house is going to be demolished. Most people will not leave hoping that it will not happen. But eventually they come, maybe a very early time of the night, and they dismiss all the people who are living in that house and demolish it while they are looking at it. This is not fiction. This is something that is done all the time. And then building more and more settlement and bringing more, and right now even more are doing. Now we come. What is the role of the United States in this? The United States has two contradictory policies. The first one, it tells the Palestinians, let's negotiate a solution to this problem. So they convince the Israelis to negotiate and the Palestinians to negotiate with the Israelis. But the Israelis continue to build settlement, and they give always an offer to the Palestinians that they couldn't possibly accept. And then that fails, and then we wait a few more years, and then the United States, like it's doing now, starts another and sort of convinces the Israelis to negotiate again. But this time, actually, President Obama and his entourage wanted Israel to stop increasing the settlement or to put a freeze on that. But right now, they are doing it even more than they did it before. So the question is, what kind of peace are they trying to establish? How is that going to happen? Let's go back to what Eisenhower did. He told the Israelis, you should not keep the land that you occupied by force. Well, not all of it, actually, because everything they occupied by force. But anyway, you have to accept that decision by the United Nations. But then, at the same time, they give them aid. How much? The estimate is at least $3 billion every year. And actually, in practice, it is much more than that. And actually, why negotiate? The idea that the decision by the United Nations is that they should go to the pre-1967 boundary. It's called the Green Line, by the way. You will hear that sometimes. So what are the negotiations for? The negotiations are only designed to win time for the Israelis so that they will take more and more. So where are we now? Some people say what should happen is there should be one state for Palestinians and Israelis. That's the way it should have been from the very beginning. Is that feasible? Well, let me tell you. The fact is, there is a one state right now, because the Palestinians are living under the jurisdiction of the Israelis. The Palestinians, of course, are being persecuted, because if you live in Palestine and you want to go to school, you want to go to a hospital, you want to visit a neighbor, you have to pass through about one or two or more what?
Checkpoint.
Yeah. No, it's one or two or three, what did you say?
Checkpoint.
Yeah, checkpoints, yes. Checkpoints usually are between one country and the other, but checkpoints are all over. There are about 500 of them in the West Bank. What else? The settlers are armed, and in addition to that, they are protected by the Israeli Defense Force, by the Israeli army. The Israeli army go in the West Bank and to protect the settlers. So what do the settlers do also? Well, they sometimes attack and beat Palestinian children. They go to the lands during the olive season, when it is being harvested. They go there armed, and they keep the Palestinians from harvesting their own produce. There's also a wall being built. It has been almost completed. The wall is supposed to be between Israel pre-1967 and the West Bank, but it is not. The wall passes within the West Bank and keeps land away from Palestinians, including land that in some village that the people who own the land cannot go or have to take a permission to go and attend to their land. So, what else? Israel has now put the people in Gaza as if they are in a prison, and they took the key, because the Palestinians in Gaza cannot move out, and then the same thing with, to some extent, but less, because Palestinians in the West Bank are allowed to move, but with a lot of restrictions. And the wall is actually about 20 inches, 20 feet, 20 feet high, and they call it the defense, sort of the security wall, or the security fence, actually they call it. It is only fence in some parts, but it is low wall in most parts, and actually the Palestinians call it apartheid wall. Why? Because right now, when you think about it, what could happen? The Palestinians are being squeezed on a daily basis from their land. They are demolishing their homes, and their access, the part that they can become a state is becoming infeasible to be a state and becoming smaller and smaller. And it is continuing right now. So the people say, a lot of people say, well, there is a one state right now, but it's an apartheid state. Apartheid refers to South Africa the way it used before Mandela, and actually it is the South Africans describe the situation as in Palestine as an apartheid. So that we come to the conclusion in this case that it's very unlikely that there will be a two-state solution. Where is it going to be? Now they are talking about a very small strip of land that will not be accepted by the Palestinians. On the other hand, if they don't have a solution, then what will happen to the Palestinians? If they stay living in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, then they are going to be living under extreme discrimination that will not result in peace, or else the Israelis will maneuver some other way of letting the rest of the Palestinians leave the country. That's where we are right now. And I will stop it. But just let me just say, the United States not only gives help, financial and military aid to the Israelis, they also defend the most atrocious attacks of Israelis on Palestinian places. For example, at the end of 2008, when President Obama was coming into office, they attacked Gaza, and they killed about 1,400 people. They demolished many homes and many schools, even United Nations schools. But what did the United States do? It actually vetoed the Security Council resolution to condemn this. In fact, the investigation that was made about what happened at that time was by a committee that was headed by a judge who was himself Jewish, Goldstone, and he said very clearly that some of what happened was war crimes. But the United States refused to accept his report, and actually, I'm going to stop in a minute, and actually they defend Israel every time a resolution is passed to condemn what Israel has done. The United States exercises a veto, and then nothing happens to Israel about that. I will stop here.